I was really nervous about doing this for some reason. I've spoken a lot. I've been a lawyer. We talk. That's what we do. But this for some reason made me kind of nervous. And I was thinking, why am I nervous? Why am I so nervous? Shaifali, you've gotten up in front of people. You've done these things. And I thought, because this is a really big topic. Curiosity. Where do ideas come from? Man has been asking himself, herself, this question forever. What could I possibly have to say? And then a wonderful thing happened. I went to the Meaning of Life panel yesterday, and I thought, wow, the meaning of life, I just have to deal with curiosity. That I can do. And then another amazing thing happened, which I think proves what we're here today to learn, which was I went to the reception after the Meaning of Life panel, and I was walking over with a guy who was on a scientific breakthroughs panel that I hosted yesterday who's hacking biotech, and somebody else who spoke about the future of work. And we walked into the bar, and at the reception was LeVar Burton within 7 feet of Elle Macpherson. And I thought, okay, Chicago Ideas Week, your work here is done, because I want to see what comes out of that conversation. So I'm not nervous anymore, and I decided I can have this conversation with you. And I don't have a PowerPoint presentation because I don't really like them, and mine broke. So I have a notebook. And what's really interesting about this notebook is that I grabbed it out of my bag at midnight last night when I was really nervous about the fact that my PowerPoint presentation broke. And I was flipping through it, and I realized it was a notebook from a conference I had attended a year and a half ago, stuck in my work bag. And lo and behold, here is the 2 top quotes on page maybe 3 of my notebook. From John Cleese, creativity is not a talent, it is a way of operating. From the scientist Claude Bernard, it is that which we do know that is the great hindrance to our learning, not that which we do not know. Okay, I'm going to start with those 2 quotes, and I'm going to ask you to remember 3 words, which in fact I think you can probably remember without a PowerPoint. Curious, open, and purpose. All right. So now I'm going to tell you my story. My story is this. As you know, I am not a scientist. I sometimes feel I'm in some sort of weird, perverse kind of AA type meeting, right? My name is Shaifali Puri, and I am not a scientist. But I do run an organization called Scientists Without Borders, and the purpose of that organization is to connect science and technology, assets, expertise, and resources to the world's most pressing and urgent challenges. And we do that by leveraging internet connection technology, mobile technology, the wonderful advances we've made to connect scientists around the world, users around the world, to open source, crowdsource, all these terms you hear in innovation around the world. But I came to Scientists Without Borders. If you'd asked me 4 years ago to make a list of 100 things I'd be doing, that probably wouldn't have made the list at all. 30 years ago, let's go back in time. 30 years ago, I grew up in Atlanta. 30 years ago, my parents would take me to the MLK Memorial because that was, 1, incredibly important, obviously, but 2, my family was from India, and the MLK Memorial was the only place in Atlanta, really, where you could find the history of Mahatma Gandhi, where you could learn about the Salt March, because obviously Martin Luther King had been so influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. So they wanted me to go there. And when we were young, we'd visit India from time to time, and I would be staggered, as everyone is, at the scale, the crushing scale of the poverty. I couldn't even imagine kids my age begging in the streets, carrying children, crawling all over the cars, and I'd come back, and it was like a whole different world, traveling between these different worlds. But I was living in the United States and growing up in the South, and so I transferred my passion and my confusion and my curiosity. How could it be? How could so many people be this poor? How could this actually be life? Didn't look like my life. To a passion for civil rights, for the civil rights movement in the South. And I thought I was going to be the next great crusading journalist. So I went off to college with this plan in mind. I had a purpose. I was going to write the next great civil rights crusading nonfiction journalist. I was going to be at the New Yorker or someplace like that. Well, after college, I went off to interview at Time magazine, in fact. I went to meet with a mentor of mine who was an editor at Time. And I said, what do I have to do? I'll do anything to work at Time. And she said, you know what, Shaifali, I think you should actually look into this other magazine, Fortune magazine. I said, Fortune magazine? What does that have to do with it? That's the anti-poverty magazine. What are you talking about? She said, nope, they've got a great editor, and I think you're going to learn some things that you don't need to know. That you need to know and you don't know already. So I thought, okay, well, I'll look into it. And it turned out that in one of my books that I loved as a kid, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, a really wonderful book written by Walker Evans, James A.G. Walker Evans collaboration, had incubated at Fortune. And well, I thought that's really interesting. I'm actually a little bit more curious about this place they call Fortune magazine. So I got a job at Fortune magazine as a fact checker. I knew nothing. And after 3 years, I had learned a ton and I loved it. But I was ready to go on, and those old sort of purpose-driven passions started tugging at me. I wanted to do something. So I went off to law school thinking, okay, you know what, I'm going to go back and I'm going to be a civil rights lawyer. Maybe if I'm not going to be a civil rights lawyer, maybe I'll be a human rights lawyer of some kind. And I went to law school, and after law school, I clerked for a year on an appellate court doing what clerks do in appellate courts. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. I mean, these con law, interesting things. But I really had, my purpose was to do human rights law. And again, somebody called me and said, you know what, there's this interesting job working with an attorney general by the name of Eliot Spitzer, doing constitutional litigation, all appellate. Why don't you go do that? And I thought, what is the point of appellate? No, I'm going to be in the field, I'm going to crusade. But I was kind of curious. This Eliot Spitzer, I looked him up. He seemed like he was doing interesting things. He was doing interesting things. So I went off to work for Eliot Spitzer. I went off to work for Eliot Spitzer, and Eliot Spitzer became the governor. And I had done all these cases, and I was ready to not be a lawyer anymore. Again, I had that curiosity. I just wanted to do something else. I thought I'd seen the law. And a person I had worked with at the Attorney General's office said, I need a deputy in economic development. And I had worked with him, in fact, on writing an article. We co-wrote an article together that had nothing to do with what we were doing with work. We were both interested in First Amendment law. And because of my days at Fortune, because of my time as a journalist, he came to me and he said, do you want to work together? And we got to talking. And he realized, you know what, I think you might just have what it takes to do this job. Total leap in the dark. And I went off to help him run the State Economic Development Agency. Well, Eliot Spitzer was doing interesting things. Eliot Spitzer could no longer be governor. And somebody I knew called me from Scientists Without Borders, and they said, we've got this platform, and it's really interesting, and it's got a lot of promise. There's a kernel here, but somehow it's not working. And I said, well, why the heck are you calling me? You must have called everybody else in New York, and everybody else in New York must have said no. What do I know about this? And he said to me, you know what? We had somebody that we thought knew a lot about this. I think we need somebody who doesn't know anything at all about this to do this. And I was curious. I had never run an organization. And I remembered those days of going to India. And I thought to myself, wait a minute. My whole life, I've tried to figure out how I could somehow connect growing up in Atlanta, a passion for civil rights, being Indian, seeing that poverty. Maybe this is my chance. Okay, so that's how I ended up at Scientists Without Borders. Carlos Miranda moved from Argentina to New Zealand 25 years ago. 30 years ago, Carlos Miranda watched a very close female friend of his lose a child to a neural tube defect because she had insufficient folic acid in her diet. Okay, remember that. That was 30 years ago that this happened to Carlos Miranda. When I went to Scientists Without Borders, I learned very, very quickly that micronutrient deficiency is one of the greatest problems in undernutrition, and that giving poor people micronutrients is one of the greatest investments you can make in global development. So we worked with our partner PepsiCo to design an incentive-based challenge. And the challenge was, how do you get folic acid to the world's poorest women at a price point that seems impossible, in a way that makes ensure that they don't have to change anything at all about their daily habits. And then, how are we going to disseminate this challenge to as many people as we possibly can? Now, how we decided to do this challenge was also kind of weird. It had turned out, when I was working at the State Economic Development Agency, that I had come across this idea of open innovation challenges and prizes. I'd read about the Netflix prize. It was starting to bubble up sometimes in cities, doing these challenges. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Why can't we do this for global development? So we issued this challenge. And we disseminated it using the wonders of connection technology to 300,000 people around the world. Now, interesting fact, internet usage has doubled in the last 5 years. You all know this. The fastest growing places for internet, the fastest growing percentages are happening in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in the Middle East. The places where a lot of the problems we are trying to tackle actually live. So one of the people who reads our challenge is Carlos Miranda. Remember, 30 years ago, Carlos Miranda had watched a very close friend mourn the loss of a child due to folic acid deficiency. Well, it turns out that about 29 years after that fact, a year before our challenge, Carlos Miranda's daughter was doing a paper on folic acid deficiency. So he had recently been reading up on the literature, and even more importantly, he had remembered what it felt like to watch his friend and be able to do nothing. And Carlos Miranda is looking on the internet and comes across the Scientists Without Borders challenge, a challenge that in my life 30 years ago wasn't even in my imagination. And Carlos Miranda starts thinking. See, he was from Argentina, and he now lives in New Zealand, just like my parents were from India, and I had grown up in the South. And Carlos Miranda thought, well, what about Argentina and New Zealand? If this has got to work in Africa and it's got to work in Asia, what do all these places have in common? What could they possibly have in common other than lots of really poor women and children who are dying at the numbers of millions due to preventable malnutrition? Well, what they have in common is salt. What we all have in common is salt. So Carlos Miranda thought, well, why can't we do what's already been done? Not an original idea, a better idea. Why can't we fortify salt with more than just iodine, a major global development advancement? So Carlos Miranda submitted and won an idea, simple, not rocket science. Why don't we quadruple fortify salt with folic acid? He won our challenge. Now, what is miraculous to me about this story, of course, is in over 30 days in our challenge, we got over 60 submissions from 22 different countries, a third from the developing world. Those are wonderful statistics and wonderful stories. But what is amazing to me is that I and Carlos Miranda had this thing that Stuart Kaufman has called adjacent possibility. We had it across the world. We had it across 3 decades in time because I had been curious my whole life about how I could connect. What did it mean to grow up in Atlanta? How could I connect that to India? Carlos had been germinating, remembering, subconsciously maybe even, what it felt like to watch a mother lose a child. And he had an opportunity. And through the open network, the open interconnected world, the internet, Carlos and I met. And through this adjacent possibility, we came up with this innovation. And so the point of my story today, the point of what I want to start the day with, is that if you're curious, if you're open, and if you're driven by a purpose is the filter, the purpose of eradicating malnutrition, of maybe even addressing the fact that more people in India have cell phones than have toilets, than the fact that we're going to need to feed 10 billion people by 2050, and how are we going to do that? You too, today, in your seats, next to you, behind you, in front of you, in the hallway, have adjacent possibility. And I can't wait to see what it reveals. Thank you so much.